and welcome to the channel. We're going to do something a bit different today. Something that combines my love of films and my love of stories and books. I'm going to do kind of book to screen. And I thought no better film stroke book to do it with than a film that I know many people have seen and a book that maybe less people have read. But I did it the other way around. I had never seen the film. Like, I don't know why. The book and film we're going to talk about are The Shining. And I'm going to talk about, you know, some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are different. So I'm going to talk about general appreciation of the film, so what people think of the film, what people think of the book. And then I'll go into some of the similarities and differences. So we'll look at differences in characters, differences in plot, and differences in general tone, I think, is what the way that I'll approach this. Now, hopefully it'll not be too long, but I do want to do it justice. I think if you've seen the film and you're wanting to know whether you should read the book, I think, just like anything, there's so much more in the book that the film couldn't do. There's so much more to add. There's so much more backstory. I think if you're a lover of the film, you will get a lot out of the book. There's a general discussion at the moment going on about Philip Chase and Critical Dragon about the idea of adaptation, and I think this kind of falls squarely into that conversation about just those two things. So in general, it's accepted, and again there was a video about this recently, is the book always better than the film? Adaptations of his stories have been poor in relation to the text, and I think for good reason, because I think King's books, there's an awful lot of internal monologue or the inner demons in this that doesn't translate as well to film. But I think the film, and certainly Kubrick's film, is such a good taking of the text, and he does away with what a lot of the criticisms I would have of the book, and that's where I'll start with. I'll talk about the tone or the timbre of the film, because if I was to say things that I struggle with in The Shining, I mean, The Shining as a book is completely grim. I'm not saying the film's like a comedy or something you'll really find jovial and laugh your way through, but the overshadowing that appears in just about every King book is particularly grim in the novelisation of The Shining. Right from the very, very start, you're told about the likely outcome of the book, kind of how dark it's going to turn. Danny, the son, pretty much telegraphs the whole thing, including, you know, I'm going to treat this as if somebody has seen either the book or the film, so I'm going to spoil the absolute bejesus out of what is the well-known story. So the red rum part of the film. Now, the red rum didn't appear until much later in the film. It's pretty much bang up front, bang up centre as a premonition in the book. I think it creates a very dark tone. Now, maybe some people will love that about the book, but for me, it just gave it a never-ending kind of push of, oh, this is all going to go bad. This is going to go bad. There's very little levity. There's very little light. Obviously, the tone of the film, I think, is split in half. You can see that there's like an escalation or a descent into madness of Jack Nicholson's character throughout the film, whereas in the book, it's kind of always there in the background. You can always see it. Let's look at some of the reasons how that's achieved. Ullman, who is the guy who runs the Overlook Hotel, is very jovial in the film adaptation. He's much more lighter. In fact, I think all the staff are very jovial and light-hearted, and they don't have a serious tone much of the way through it at all. In the book, Ullman's grumpy. He's kind of serious. You know, Dick Halloran is pretty much the same in both. The biggest character that's missing from the film that is very prominent in the book, I think, is the hotel itself, the Overlook Hotel. Now, it's funny, while there are certain things that Shining such a famous film, you couldn't help but see and think of Jack Nicholson when I was even reading the book. Hadn't seen the film, but I knew what the famous scenes that are in there, so I knew the kind of crazy hair, all of that kind of stuff was in there. I didn't know what the Overlook Hotel was, and certainly when I was reading the book, I kind of had this feeling that it was a lot more claustrophobic than what the film is. Now, not because of anything necessarily in the page, but I think just because of the very nature and the menacing nature of the hotel itself. If you look at how the film portrays, or certainly in my reading of it, is that it's very much about Jack's descent into madness, whereas the book is very much more about the hotel being a malevolent force and manipulating Jack to do what he's doing. Now, there's a bit of that in the film, certainly. They have the Delaware Grant character that comes in, and I think when I was thinking about how I would adapt it, I kind of thought you would have to have a front-facing character that kind of talked out and spoke to Jack. But it was only here and there I would have had it very much more frontline and centre. Now obviously the success of the film says Kubrick knew what he was doing, but you get this idea that the Overlook Hotel was just sitting there, and you get no sense of the history of the Overlook Hotel. The bad history of it, the events that had happened, the litany of things that had happened over the years. You get mentioned very briefly in the film, but it's like an overbearing feeling that even all of the staff have about it. The hedge maze is there. You have no hedge animals. There's hedge animals in the book, very prominently in the book. They play a big part in kind of illustrating to the reader just how things are different, or how Jack's been manipulated. They're not in at all. Although the hedge maze obviously is there and does play a prominent role in how the story resolves in the film. The other massive plot point that's changed from the novel to the book, or vice versa, is this idea of the maintenance, or that Jack is the caretaker of it. I mean, the film kind of splits the duties between the whole family in some ways, but in the book it's very clearly Jack's job. And I'll come back to Jack in a second, but one of the key parts, of course, in the book is the idea of the boiler. And the fact that this is an ageing hotel and needs an awful lot of love and care, both in terms of maintenance of the bit itself, but also of the people that it's got inside it. And in the book, the boiler, and the idea that the boiler needs careful attention the whole way through it, is pretty much the de facto plot point of the entire piece. So you don't see Jack finding things out about the hotel or getting fascinated with being in the hotel and being part of it. Like he's very much the caretaker of looking after the bits, but he's also the custodian of the hotel, and he takes that very, very personally. And actually it's through his exploration of being the custodian that you really get an idea of how the hotel could get inside his head. It's one of the nice parts, I think, of the film is the very end, of course, where it kind of alludes to that idea that there's maybe more going on here than just Jack turning up and getting the job as the caretaker over the winter months. But it kind of, like I say, plays a much more prominent role throughout the entire book. I'll go on to Jack because Jack's a very interesting character, obviously, in it. I mean, he's portrayed as a madman, but in the book, he's much more of an inquisitive and thinking character. I mean, most King characters are on page. They think an awful lot. You get to see inside their head, but we get none of his outside relationships or relationships before the Overlook Hotel. About the fact that he was a teacher, the fact that he had a career, and okay, it's alluded to that they had the incident with Danny where he's dislocated. Wasn't dislocated in the film, where he actually broke it in the book. That there was another incident with a kid in school, and it was a culmination of these incidents alongside his heavy drinking at the time that caused them to go and search for the job in the Overlook. And it goes a long way to explain actually the panic of why they would stay in the hotel and why they were cut off, because this was very much, and everybody was very much aware that this was last chance saloon for them as a family. That Jack had kind of screwed up his life a lot, that he needed to make this work, and that they as a family needed to make this work. And actually that part of the reason why they would make excuses or wonder what was actually happening was because they wanted it desperately to be a happy place. And certainly for the first part of the book it works. It is a very positive influence on their family. They talk about mending and healing the relationship. You know, the relationship, Jack and Wendy's relationship, was in troubled times obviously because of the things that had happened, but that it was healing and mending, and that actually it was the malevolent nature of the hotel that started to play and twist at Jack himself. We also get no sense of who Jack was as a person, about how his relationships of his own parents and of his own family played into kind of what ended up happening to him. I mean, one of the most incredible pieces of writing in the book is a scene where Jack's looking into his past and into the way that his relationship with his dad and his mother was, and how they treated the rest of the family, and how the lines start to blur between what he has in his past in terms of trauma and what's happening being manipulated at the moment. And he starts to get really confused about which is real and what's imaginary. And it's such an incredible piece of writing in the book that it's I don't know how you would have filmed it, but it's definitely not there in the film. You don't get the sense that he's struggling with reality, that he's struggling between, you know, what he should be doing, who he is as a person, and actually, you know, what he thinks and his opinion of people or of him is so important to Jack, I think, because of it. Just like anybody that's had a traumatic upbringing, they search for acceptance, they search for people to give them praise, they search for the positive things in life, and when people don't do that, they kind of push back. And again, missing in the film, definitely there in the book. And again, another good reason that if you're missing or wanting to know if there's more in the book than there is in the film, there's lots more there. There's lots to delve into. It's really fascinating in that regard. There's a slight scene in the film as well where he's awakened from a dream. I think, again, we don't see the dream. It was probably a great idea to leave it out, but there's more to be captured in there as well. That's in the book and kind of, again, refers to his past and the things that are happening. And again, you don't get the characters then to play that link Jack to the Overlook. There are other things at play in the book that obviously weren't put in. It wasn't necessary, I think, for the film. The film's already overly long, probably in some ways. It's 2 hours 20 or something like that. It was already at a length that I think you were definitely looking to take things out instead of adding bits in. So, like I say, I think that's a better film than it is book. But you have an unlimited page length here. I mean, it's already, 500 odd pages? Yeah, just short of 500 pages in this version of the book. There's a lot to cram in, but I haven't watched, and while I think it's an average book, I think my criticisms are not of the writing or not of the flavours that are put in by King. I think they're all fantastic and actually create, between the two things together, a really positive and meaty look at how you tell stories and how you portray stories. I think that bit's amazing. The other prominent change from the film to the book, and again, some people might disagree if they've seen the film, that I'm going to say that, that Danny's intelligence, and especially emotional intelligence, does not come out in the film at all. People will say, God, it's shown that he is. Certainly at the very, very end, the resolution of the film, you see how smart he is. But from the very first page of this book, when we actually see as much of Danny's perspective and POV in the book, he's an incredibly intelligent child. There are things that he doesn't know because he's a child. He doesn't have knowledge, but his emotional intelligence and his ability to read people is missing. He senses other people's emotions, even if he's not in the same room with them. This character of Tony that he says is in his mouth is portrayed slightly differently in the book as well. He's kind of like, again, Tony is portrayed as this kind of bad force in him, but he's a companion for Danny. Danny's an isolated child, and he kind of fills in a lot of the gaps for Danny in the book. And kind of portrays things to watch out for. It's kind of like a representation of his emotional intelligence. It's like the more grown-up side of him. He really drives an awful lot of the thinking and the questioning, and I suppose the grimness of the book itself, the Tony character. But it's actually as you move through the book, and you kind of see how the hotel affects Danny. Obviously, affects his father, but it affects Danny as well, and it's much more subtle in terms of Danny. His emotional intelligence is so far out of the scale. You don't get any of that in the film, I don't think. You don't get how he sees, and his imagination works like an awful lot of kids' imagination. You don't see it run wild. There's no fire hose. There's no even devilment in him. His visit to the room is kind of like the keys in the door in the film. He steals the key out of interest and out of curiosity in the book. And he kind of brings it upon himself, and that's part of his kind of trepidation about, what's actually happening in the hotel. Is maybe he deserved it, or maybe it was his fault. And it's about, how a young mind is manipulated compared to an adult. I think the character of Danny is just absolutely fascinating in the book. Like I say, we spend an awful lot of time in his company. His POV is very strong in the book, whereas we basically see him run about on his little kind of tricycle kind of thing that he pops about and having fun, but he's very much more aware of what's going on, and actually of dates and times, and the impending doom that's coming along for him. You see, his relationship with Dick is actually, I think, it's quite closely done. They do it slightly differently, obviously, depending on location, but that closeness with Dick and how he reaches him is quite well portrayed, and I think that the general use of that character is well done. Although, and I'll come back to it in the plot, actually his outcome is a bit different. And then the other main one that I'll talk about then obviously is Wendy. And like I say, there's little acknowledgement of the strife that they've had in their marriage. It's kind of undercurrent. I think you can read between the performance that's in there of the problems that they've had. She makes excuses for him. But the one scene that I think is missing, that when I was reading the book and I was making sort of notes because I was planning to do this, I kind of have a big star or highlighted a bit where, you know, she's really not sure who's the bad guy here. And again, it ties into the idea of the bad guy in the film is very clearly Jack, whereas in the book it's clearly, you know, the hotel itself. But she just thinks because of the dislocated shoulder, etc., and arm, that it's definitely Jack just returning to drinking. It's that bad side of him, etc. And there's a scene in the book where Danny and her go out for the day, and it becomes very clear that it's not just Jack. There's more going on play here, and I thought in the book, it was one of the clear moments of levity that the story had, is that there was like an opening or a reveal somewhere through the book that Wendy knew a bit more of an understanding of what was going on, and actually the drive to get them out of there changed. They removed a lot of that following bit that follows it in the film, but it was such a clear moment to say that she became aware of what was happening in the location they were in, and was happening with her family and the people that she loved, and who to be afraid of and why to be afraid. And it actually created more terror in the book because it kind of came outside of her control of what she was doing. So all of those characters, I think, are slightly changed. I mean, you get way more stages and way more depth in the book than you can or you ever could in the film. But like I say, a lot of the bits of the film, they kind of play and let the audience work out what actually is going on there. And again, this is one of the key points that I would like to hear about people who haven't read the book and only seen the film, whether they get that undercurrent or subtext through the film and the filmmaking, because I think it is one of the things that makes it such a great film, is that Kubrick manages to put that in bits that he doesn't need to spell it out for you in as many words or as many minutes on film. So we'll talk about differences in plot. And like, I don't want to go through every single bit. I've alluded to some of them there, but I think some of the really key ones that jump out, obviously, is the reveal of, you know, Jack's writing. You know, in the film, it builds up. You see him typing away. He complains about not being able to work. As I've said before, he is able to work in the book for a long part, and then it starts to devolve. But I think that all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and how that changes and goes through, it's just masterful in the film. Having even read the book and seen how that was changed or done or otherwise was still a joy in the film, because that's the reveal for Wendy that it's Jack's the malevolent part there. He's the reason that things are going bad. He's the bit person to be scared of. So when he's chasing her around the hotel, he's the thing to be afraid of. I think that's very clearly in the screenplay, and an adaptation of that part in the book. Like, Jack desperately wants to be able to write. He constantly talks about it and saying, if we could just get this book finished, it would give him another way to be salvation for his family. He could leave the hotel and he would have another option other to be the caretaker of this building. And while I say it's wonderfully done, it definitely is a change. Both are done well. If I were to pick one, I really do like the reveal in the film, but you are missing who the bad guy is in it. Halloran's End is very different in the book compared to the film as well. What's really interesting about the film versus the book for me is the ending of the film is the one that I think the book sets up as the most natural end for Dick Halloran. So there's no real criticism of the bit there. It's kind of what I felt was bound to happen there. It didn't end up happening. It's a very different end, like I say, but it's a very prominent and key piece of it, because I think Dick Halloran, in the book, there's whole chapters devoted to Dick Halloran's POV and how he tries to get through and how he helps. I mean, there's bits about, you know, the outside world. Again, I can see why they removed it. You know, Jack smashes the radio on purpose so that they can't be contacted. And like I say, the big difference in plot is that Jack's deranged versus the hotel is manipulating him. This idea of presenting him with drink and him being drunk, but without there being the presence of drink, is common to both. But definitely the idea that Jack descends into madness because of somebody's in his ear all the time is very clear in the book. And then you've got the ending. The ending's wildly different. I don't know what anybody feels about the ending of The Shining and how it kind of peters out. it wasn't very satisfying. And this is so ironic because, again, King, in his books, the criticism is that he fumbles a lot of his endings. I think the ending in the book is great. Certainly in comparison to the ending of the film, I think he does a great job of this. Maybe it's too elongated, maybe they run out of money, maybe there's lots of bits there. The bit at the end of the film is obviously, it's a cleverness, and that it kind of wears himself out, that kind of anger and rage burns itself out, whereas the opposite is true in the book. As it turns out, you know, that metaphor is very, very different. Fascinated to hear what people think of the film ending if they haven't read the book, and then, you know, you want to pick up the book and read just the end, kind of 5 or 6 chapters. Certainly do that again. And then you've got the idea, a bit that really surprised me and I wasn't expecting when it came to watching the film, is how prominent the music and the soundtrack is. I mean, it's almost turned up another 10 decibels compared to nearly anything else that you'll see. It's so prominent. It is right there to enforce the tone of the film, I think, and you know, kind of give you that light with the shade. I would need to watch it a couple of times more to really get the sense of like an isolated score. If I got the isolated score and listen to it, maybe it would give me a very clear idea of exactly what is happening and the manipulation of the audience is happening with the soundtrack. But it is so prominent, and it is obviously a very much a centerpiece of the film itself, because it's obviously a bit that couldn't be in the book. You don't get any of those kind of senses to being used. You don't get sound as a thing being used in books, whereas you've obviously got it in film. And Kubrick, being the master that he was, obviously used the senses as much as he could. So that's my comparison between The Shining, the novelisation, and The Shining, the book. If you love the film and you quite like to get in the book, I don't think the book's better, but I think if you're already familiar with the story, you'll actually get a lot out of reading the novelisation, because an adaptation of the story, it adds so much more. There's so much more to delve into for motivation and to make things reasonable, and to kind of, I don't think either the film or the book are scary, I will say that, in any way, shape or form. There's like a dread, it's almost like a thriller than a horror, as opposed to other films of that ilk. It's said in the extras that it was very much a response to the horror films of the 70s, which were all the rage, and that Kubrick knew he could do just as well. Well, I mean, he proved that, but I think by today's standards both are quite thrilling as opposed to scary, but maybe that's just me. If you've enjoyed this, please let me know. It's something I really enjoyed doing. It's something that I could just do for Stephen King alone, because obviously there's a lot of interpretations of his works that have been done on screen and done in books, etc. And it's a good impetus for me to read more King, because I do love reading King. Like I say, if you enjoyed this, let me know. If you haven't enjoyed it, tell me what bits you didn't, or what bits I left out, what you'd like to see more discussion on, because while I didn't want it to be too long, I did want it to be worth watching, and that somebody will get something out of, especially if they've read and seen both the book and the movie. Alright, I'll speak to you again soon, and take care.